Setting the stage. The cold truth of a 14th-century winter. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's the middle of January somewhere in Europe, about the year 1348. Snow falls silently, blanketing the fields where wheat once stood, tall. The river is frozen, the sky a dull gray, and the only sound is the wind whistling through the cracks of wooden shutters. The warmth of modern heating, the hum of electric lights, and the convenience of a stocked refrigerator are unimaginable luxuries. For the average man, woman, or child living in the 14th century, the world outside is hostile, and survival through winter is a daily battle. This is not the medieval romanticism of nights by the fire or feasts in castle halls. This is the reality of common people, farmers, peasants, townsfolk, whose lives hinged on their ability to prepare months in advance, to ration food with discipline, and to endure cold that seeped into their bones. The modern comforts we take for granted simply didn't exist. To truly understand why you, sitting comfortably today, likely wouldn't survive a medieval winter, we need to step into their shoes and feel what life was really like. The weight of winter for people in the 14th century. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. Survival meant planning months in advance. Fail to store enough grain, your family starves. Fail to collect enough fuel, you freeze. Fall ill at the wrong time? There's no hospital nearby, and herbal remedies may or may not work. The 14th century was especially brutal because of the climatic shift we now call the Little Ice Age. Winters were colder, longer, and more unpredictable than in earlier centuries. Crops failed more often, rivers froze solid. And for peasants who made up the majority of the population, there was no backup plan. The wealthy might retreat to stone halls, their hearths blazing with expensive wood. But most people lived in small, drafty cottages made of timber, wattle, and daub, walls woven from sticks and packed with mud, which cracked and crumbled under the stress of frost. To Americans today, used to insulated homes and thermostats, it's almost unimaginable. A medieval peasant house leaked heat like a sieve. Wind blew through gaps in the walls. Roofs, thatched with straw or reeds, let in drips of melting snow. There was no central chimney, just an open hearth in the middle of the room, filling the air with smoke. Families huddled together, often with animals nearby, using body heat as much as fire to keep from freezing. The rhythm of preparation. To survive winter, the year's entire rhythm revolved around preparation. Summer was for growing. Autumn was for harvesting and storing. Winter was for surviving. By November, fields were already empty. Wheat, rye, and barley had been cut and stored in wooden bins or clay jars. Turnips, onions, and leeks, staple vegetables of the medieval diet, were dug up and kept in cellars or buried under layers of straw to prevent freezing. Meat from livestock that couldn't be fed through winter, pigs, sometimes cattle, was slaughtered, salted, smoked, or dried. Every household's survival hinged on these stores lasting until spring. There were no supermarkets to run to if supplies ran low. If a family ran out of food in January, February, or March, the harshest months, there was little hope. The fields lay barren, the soil frozen solid. Hunting was an option but dangerous. Game was scarce in winter, and peasants often lacked the right to hunt, as laws reserved deer and boar for nobility. Fishing, too, was limited when rivers froze. Imagine standing in a dimly lit cottage, surrounded by your family, looking at dwindling sacks of grain and knowing there are still 3 months of winter ahead. That anxiety was part of every winter. Theo. Cold indoors, we might assume that medieval people were simply tougher than we are today. And in some ways they were. But don't mistake endurance for comfort. Inside a typical peasant home, the only source of heat was the hearth. A fire of wood, peat, or dung smoldered in the center of the room. There was no chimney as we know it today. Smoke rose and lingered, before escaping through a hole in the roof or cracks in the thatch. The air was thick and acrid. People coughed constantly. Soot clung to the walls and ceiling. And yet, despite this smoke, the heat barely reached the corners of the room. I knew. Floor, often just packed earth, remained icy cold. To sleep, families gathered on straw pallets or simple wooden frames covered with wool blankets, cloaks, or animal skins. Everyone slept close together, often several children pressed between parents, with dogs or goats nearby for extra warmth. It wasn't just comfort at stake. Hypothermia was a real risk, especially for the very young and the elderly. People didn't use the word hypothermia, but they knew that cold could kill. Frostbite, too, was common in exposed fingers and toes. In towns and villages, it wasn't unusual to hear of someone found lifeless in a barn or by the roadside, overcome by the cold. Daily life in the dark, one of the greatest challenges of winter, wasn't just the cold, it was the dark. In the 14th century, there were no electric lights, no glowing screens. After sunset, which in winter might come before 5 p.m., the world went dark. The only light inside homes came from the fire, a rushlight made from reeds dipped in fat, or a small tallow candle if the household could afford it. These sources of light were dim, smoky, and short-lived. Reading was a luxury reserved for the wealthy anyway, but even simple tasks like mending clothes or preparing food became difficult. Most evenings were spent gathered around the fire, talking, telling stories, or singing songs. Winter was a time of togetherness, but also of long, dragging hours of idleness. For a modern American used to 24-hour electricity, this forced rhythm, dark nights stretching endlessly, would feel alien, even unsettling. The psychological weight of winter was heavy, days were short, work was hard, and the nights seemed endless. Food on the table. So, what did people actually eat during these cold months? The backbone of the diet was grain. Rye, barley, oats, sometimes wheat if you were fortunate. Bread was the daily staple, though the bread of the poor was coarse and dark, often mixed with beans, peas, or even ground-up acorns when supplies ran low. Porridge, known as pottage, was another constant. A thick stew made by boiling grains with whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, turnips, cabbages. Meat was rare in winter. Most animals were slaughtered in late autumn, and the preserved meat had to be stretched carefully. A slice of salted pork might be cut small and used to flavor a large pot of pottage, giving the illusion of meat without actually providing much. Eggs were scarce since hens laid fewer in the cold and dark. Fresh milk was almost non-existent as cows were not producing during the winter months. Instead, people relied on cheese made earlier in the year. Beer and ale, however, remained a staple. Brewed from barley, it was safer to drink than water, which often carried disease. It also provided calories, which were vital in winter. For the wealthy, wine imported from warmer regions was an option, but for most, ale was the drink of choice. Fasting, imposed by the church, added another layer of hardship. Large portions of the calendar prohibited meat, dairy, or eggs. Fish was permitted, but not always available. Obedience to these fasting days often meant surviving on bread, vegetables, and thin pottage, even when bodies craved fat and protein most. Winter diseases, cold itself was not the only killer. Winter brought waves of disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Crowded, smoky houses spread coughs and fevers. When one member of the family fell ill, the rest often followed. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals. Healing was left to herbal remedies, charms, and the care of family members. Sometimes these worked: garlic poultices for coughs, honey for wounds. But often, illness lingered or worsened. In the 14th century, life expectancy was already low, and winter was one of the reasons why. Imagine facing pneumonia without modern medicine, or enduring a toothache without dentistry. For many, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Issue: role of community. Despite all this hardship, winter was not faced alone. Communities were tight-knit. Neighbors helped each other. Shared meals, borrowed food, and small acts of charity kept families from starvation. The church played a central role too, offering alms, managing granaries, and enforcing fasting, but also providing feast days as morale boosters. Winter festivals like Christmas and Candlemas were more than just religious observances. They were Essential breaks in the bleakness, times when music, feasting, and celebration lifted spirits. In the darkest season, people clung to light wherever they could find it. Why you probably wouldn't survive now. Picture yourself suddenly transported to this world. You're dressed in your modern clothes, standing in a medieval village as the snow falls. At first, the novelty might thrill you. The crackle of a fire, the sight of stars unspoiled by electricity. But within days, the realities would sink in. You wouldn't know how to layer wool properly to keep warm. You wouldn't know how to start a fire without matches. You wouldn't have the stamina for the heavy labor of cutting wood, hauling water, or mending tools in freezing conditions. Your stomach, used to processed and plentiful foods, would rebel at coarse bread and watery pottage. Your immune system, unused to constant exposure to smoke and germs, might collapse quickly. For a medieval peasant, these challenges were ordinary, expected, endured. For us, they would be overwhelming. Homes against the cold. Shelter in a 14th century winter. When you imagine shelter in the 14th century, don't picture a cozy log cabin with smoke rising gently from a stone chimney. Instead, imagine something smaller, humbler, and often much rougher. Most people in Europe lived in cottages made from wattle and daub, a framework of woven wooden sticks, plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes dung. The result was a wall that looked sturdy enough in summer but cracked, shrank, and let in drafts during the coldest months. A home in the medieval countryside was not a fortress against winter. It was more like a fragile shell, just barely enough to keep snow and wind at bay. To understand the struggle of a 14th century winter, we have to step inside these homes and see how they were built, how they functioned, and how families adapted them for survival. The typical peasant cottage. Most peasants lived in single-room houses, rarely larger than 20 feet by 40 feet. The floor was packed earth, sometimes scattered with rushes or straw to soften the hardness and absorb waste. In winter, fresh rushes or straw might be laid down more often to help insulate from the biting cold that seeped up from the ground. The walls, made of wattle and daub, were only a few inches thick. They had no insulation by modern standards. Wind slipped through cracks, and moisture from rain and snow softened the clay, leading to crumbling patches that had to be repaired with fresh mud. The roof was usually thatched, bundles of straw, reeds, or heather tied tightly to wooden rafters. A good thatch could last years, but it was never perfect. In winter, snow collected on top, and as it melted, cold drips sometimes leaked through. Families kept buckets or pots handy to catch water, and in some homes, straw mats were hung inside, beneath the roof to catch drips before they reached the sleeping area, the hearth without a chimney. The single most important feature of any medieval home was the hearth. Positioned in the center of the room, the hearth was simply a fire built on a patch of stones or hard clay. Smoke rose and collected in the rafters, slowly filtering out through a louver, a small vent in the roof, holes in the thatch, or cracks in the walls. This design had two effects. The house was smoky. Eyes stung, lungs burned, and everything from clothing to bedding smelled of smoke. The heat escaped quickly. With no chimney to draw air efficiently, fires didn't burn as hot, and warmth often failed to reach more than a few feet from the flames. Families would huddle as close to the hearth as possible. At night, embers were banked under ashes to preserve heat until morning, when the fire could be stirred back to life. Losing the fire was dangerous. Starting a new one from scratch required flint, steel, tinder, and dry kindling, all difficult to manage in damp, snowy weather. Sleeping arrangements. Medieval families used every trick they could to trap warmth. Beds, if they had them, were simple wooden frames filled with straw, hay, or dried leaves. Over this went woolen blankets, patched cloaks, or animal skins. Poorer families often lacked proper beds altogether and simply slept on mats of straw laid near the fire. Crucially, families slept together. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents shared the same bed or sleeping space. Modesty was less important than survival. The heat of several bodies pressed together meant the difference between shivering all night and achieving some measure of comfort. Even livestock contributed. In many homes, Animals, particularly chickens, goats, or pigs, were brought inside during winter nights. Their body heat added warmth to the room, and their presence provided both security and a kind of companionship. Larger houses sometimes had two levels, with animals stabled below and people living above, so the heat from the animals would rise. Furniture and layout space was limited, so the layout of a medieval home was functional, not decorative. A long table might dominate the center, with benches along its sides. In winter, meals were eaten as close to the fire as possible. Small stools or chests doubled as seating and storage. Light came from the fire, rushlights, or small tallow lamps, simple, dishes filled with animal fat and a wick. These gave off little light and an unpleasant smell, but were all that most families could afford. To conserve warmth, some families used bed boxes, enclosed wooden frames with sliding doors or curtains, almost like little cupboards where people could crawl in to sleep. Once inside, body heat stayed trapped, making them surprisingly warm compared to the rest of the house. These were more common in Northern Europe, where winters were especially harsh. Insulating the home, though they lacked modern insulation, medieval people used clever methods to reduce drafts. In winter, doorways were often covered with heavy cloths or animal hides to block wind. Gaps in walls were stuffed with moss, straw, or rags. Floors might be layered with extra rushes or straw for insulation. Windows, when they existed, were small and unglazed. They were covered with oiled cloth, parchment, or wooden shutters. During winter, these shutters stayed closed almost constantly, keeping out snow and wind but plunging the home into dimness. Every decision was about balance: block too much air, and smoke built up dangerously inside. Leave too many gaps and freezing drafts crept in. Families lived in a constant negotiation with the elements, adjusting their shelters day by day, townhouses and better homes, while peasants in the countryside lived in humble cottages. Townsfolk often had timber-framed houses, sometimes 2 or 3 stories tall. These were still drafty by modern standards, but offered more space. The ground floor might serve as a workshop or shopfront with living quarters above. Wealthier families could afford stone houses with larger hearths, better-built chimneys, and even glazed windows in some cases. These homes were far more comfortable, but they were the exception. For the vast majority, winter meant enduring cold, smoke, and cramped living conditions. The manor house and the hall for the nobility, winter was endured in manor houses or castles. These great halls had massive open hearths, sometimes large enough to burn entire tree trunks. Even so, heat dissipated quickly in such vast spaces, and guests often wore cloaks indoors. Servants carried braziers, small portable fire pans, to provide extra warmth in specific areas. Tapestries hung on walls served more than a decorative purpose. They added insulation, blocking drafts from stone walls. Floors were strewn with rushes, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or thyme, which gave off fragrance when stepped on and helped keep pests at bay. Yet even in these grand halls, people felt the cold. Letters and chronicles from the 14th century speak of frosted breath inside rooms and ink freezing in inkwells. Wealth lessened the hardship but did not erase it. The challenge of firewood. A warm home required fuel, and fuel was not always easy to come by. Forests near villages were quickly depleted, and peasants often faced restrictions on gathering wood, as lords controlled woodland rights. When wood was scarce, people turned to alternatives. Peat, dug from bogs, dried and burned. Dung, animal, droppings mixed with straw dried into cakes. Crop residue, stalks of beans, peas, or straw. These fuels produced less heat and more smoke than wood, but they were vital. Families rationed fuel carefully, often keeping fires low during the day and saving wood for the coldest nights. Winter repairs. Winter also tested the durability of homes. Heavy snow could collapse thatched roofs if not shaken off. Strong winds tore at shutters and doors. Families performed constant repairs, patching walls with mud, replacing thatch, mending fences for animals. In towns, fire was a constant danger. Dry timber, crowded houses, and open flames created a recipe for disaster. Entire streets sometimes burned, leaving people homeless in the middle of winter. Emotional weight of shelter. A home in the 14th century was both a refuge and a prison. In winter, families spent long hours indoors, huddled together in smoky, dimly lit rooms. Cabin fever set in, though they would not have used that phrase. Arguments flared. Children grew restless. Yet leaving the safety of home meant facing freezing winds, treacherous roads, and the risk of frostbite. For us, living in spacious, heated houses with separate bedrooms and bright lights, it is hard to imagine how confined and dark these spaces felt. Survival was possible, but comfort was rare. Contrast with modern America. Imagine bringing someone from 14th century Europe into an American home today in January. To them, our houses would feel like miracles. Warmth at the push of a button, windows that keep out drafts, lights at any hour of the night, separate rooms, thick mattresses, and enough blankets to feel luxurious. By contrast, if you were dropped into their world, in a wattle and daub cottage with smoke filling your lungs and snow seeping through the roof, the experience would be overwhelming. You wouldn't know how to manage the fire, how to patch the roof, or how to ration the small amount of fuel. For the medieval family, though, these struggles were simply life. They expected discomfort. They endured because they had to. And through clever building, communal effort, and constant adaptation, they made their shelters just good enough to carry them through winter after winter. Food for the long winter, preservation, storage, and survival. Diets. If warmth was one battle in the 14th century winter, food was the other. Every meal eaten in January or February depended on the success or failure of preparations made months earlier. Unlike today, where Americans can step into a grocery store stocked year-round with strawberries in December and oranges in March, medieval people had to work with what they had stored, grown, or preserved. And those supplies had to last until spring. In many ways, food was the true currency of survival. A well-stocked cellar meant security. An empty granary meant hunger, illness, and sometimes death. Let's step into a medieval kitchen, or what passed for one, and see how people managed their food through the darkest months of the year. The cycle of the year. For medieval peasants, food wasn't just about eating. It was about timing. The agricultural year dictated what was available. Spring, fresh greens appeared, milk returned, lambs were born. Summer, grains ripened, vegetables grew, and fish were plentiful in rivers. Autumn, the great harvest. Grains, vegetables, apples, nuts. Livestock were fattened and then slaughtered before winter. Winter survival from storage. The cycle was relentless. Mistakes in autumn, harvesting too late, failing to salt meat properly, losing grain to damp, were paid for in February with hunger. Grain, the backbone of the diet. If there was one food that medieval people could not survive without, it was grain. Wheat was prized but not always available. It grew best in fertile soil, and much of it went to lords or monasteries as tax. Common folk relied on rye, oats, and barley, which were hardier and grew in poorer soils. Grain was stored in bins, barrels or sacks often kept in lofts above the main living area, to protect from damp and rodents. Despite these precautions, spoilage was common. Rats, mice, and insects chewed through stores. Mold grew in damp conditions. Entire harvests could be ruined if not carefully tended. The grain became bread and porridge, the staples of winter. Bread was coarse, dense, and dark, nothing like the soft loaves we know today. Sometimes it was mixed with beans, peas, or even ground acorns to stretch supplies. Porridge or pottage was a catch-all dish. Grains boiled slowly with vegetables, herbs, and scraps of meat when available. It filled bellies, provided warmth, and could be endlessly varied depending on what was on hand. Preserving meat was precious. Most families couldn't afford to keep livestock alive all winter. They required too much feed. So in late autumn, animals were slaughtered. Pigs, sheep, and sometimes cattle were butchered, and the meat was carefully preserved. Methods included Salting. Meat was packed in layers of coarse salt inside barrels. Salt drew out moisture and prevented decay. It was expensive but essential. Smoking. Cuts of meat hung above a low, smoky fire for days or weeks, absorbing both flavor and preservative qualities. Drying. Thin strips of meat were dried in the open air or in warm lofts, creating a jerky-like product. Potted meat. Cooked meat sealed under a thick layer of fat in ceramic pots, which kept out air and bacteria. In the dead of winter, these preserved meats were used sparingly. A bit of salted pork might flavor a whole pot of pottage, but families rarely ate meat in large portions. Meat was a seasoning, not a main course. Dairy and cheese-fresh milk was scarce in winter because most cows and goats were not producing during the cold months. The solution was cheese and butter, made earlier in the year and stored. Hard cheeses, aged and dried, lasted for months. They were tough and salty, but provided vital protein and fat. Butter, salted or clarified, could also last, though it was a luxury for many peasants. Curds and softer cheeses were eaten quickly after making, usually in warmer months. By winter, only the most durable dairy products survived. Vegetables and roots. One of the most important survival strategies was the storage of root vegetables. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, leeks, and cabbages were essential. These were stored in cellars, pits, or clamps, holes dug in the earth lined with straw, filled with vegetables, and then covered again with soil and more straw. The ground's natural coolness kept the vegetables from freezing, while the straw provided insulation. Cabbages, hardy and abundant, were particularly important. They might be eaten fresh, boiled into pottage, or preserved by fermenting into something like sauerkraut. Onions and leeks flavored countless dishes. Without these stored vegetables, diets would have collapsed into bread and gruel alone, fish and fasting. The church dictated much of the medieval diet, especially in winter. Strict fasting rules forbade meat on many days, Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entire season of Lent leading up to Easter. This meant that fish was crucial. Coastal communities fished in the sea. Inland communities relied on rivers, lakes, or man-made ponds stocked with carp, pike, or eels. Preserved fish, especially herring, was traded widely. Salted herring from the North Sea reached markets across Europe. For many families, fish was the main protein source in winter, especially during fasting periods. Even so, access depended on location and wealth. Fruit and nuts. Fresh fruit was rare in winter, but apples and pears harvested in autumn could be stored in cool, dry places. Dried fruit, raisins, figs, dates, was imported but expensive, usually reserved for the wealthy or for festive occasions. Nuts, such as hazelnuts and walnuts, were valuable. They provided fat and calories, were easy to store, and could be eaten raw or added to pottage. For poorer families, nuts gathered from the forest were a lifeline. Herbs, spices, and flavor. For modern palates, medieval winter food might seem bland. But people did use herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, garlic, mustard seeds, to add flavor. These could be dried or stored and were often grown in small kitchen gardens. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves existed, but were luxuries. Imported from Asia through long trade routes, they were costly and rare. A pinch of pepper could cost a day's wages for a laborer. For most peasants, winter meals were simple, earthy, and repetitive. Drinks, ale, beer, and cider water was not always safe to drink, especially in towns where waste contaminated rivers and wells. Instead, people drank ale or small beer, weakly brewed, low in alcohol, and consumed daily even by children. In apple-growing regions, cider was common. In wealthier households, wine, imported from France, Spain, or Italy, was consumed, but this was rare among peasants. Ale brewing was a constant task. Women, often called alewives, brewed small batches for family use, using barley, oats, or whatever grain was available. This daily drink was vital for hydration and calories during the long, cold months. Rationing and scarcity. One of the hardest parts of winter survival was rationing. Families had to calculate how long their stores would last. Eat too much in December, and you risked starvation in March. Eat too little and malnutrition set in. Rationing was especially difficult when disease struck or when more mouths to feed appeared unexpectedly, such as relatives needing help. Hunger was a constant companion. Chroniclers describe the lean months, late winter and early spring, as times when people scraped by on whatever they could find: boiled nettles, bark bread, or thin soups stretched with anything edible. Feasts and festivals. Despite hardship, winter wasn't all grimness. Festivals punctuated the darkness. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas were celebrated with feasts. Families saved their best foods, perhaps a chicken, some honey cakes, or dried fruits, for these occasions. These festivals were not only about religion or community but also about morale. Sharing better food, even if briefly, lifted spirits and reminded people that winter would eventually end. Comparison to modern America. For a modern American, used to refrigerators, supermarkets, and endless variety, a medieval winter diet would feel shockingly limited. Imagine months of dark bread, cabbage stew, and weak ale, broken only occasionally by salted pork or cheese. No coffee, no chocolate, no citrus fruits. Your body, accustomed to sugar and fat, would struggle with the monotony and scarcity. And without the vitamins we take for granted, you might quickly develop deficiencies: scurvy from lack of vitamin C, weakness from lack of protein, fatigue from lack of calories. For medieval people, however, this diet was normal. Their bodies adapted, and their expectations were different. They valued survival above variety, and the rhythm of feast and fast shaped their sense of time. Food as a measure of survival. In the end, food was the true dividing line of winter survival. A family with a full granary, well-salted meat, and carefully stored vegetables could make it through. A family with poor harvests, bad luck, or disease in their livestock might not. Every bite eaten in February was a reminder of the work done in August. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of pottage was a triumph of planning and perseverance. Wrapped in wool, clothing and textiles for winter survival. If you lived in the 14th century, your first defense against the cold wasn't your home, it was what you wore. While today in the U.S. we can pull on insulated jackets, synthetic fabrics, waterproof boots, and heated gloves, medieval people relied on natural materials and clever layering to keep warm. Clothing wasn't just fashion, it was survival. And every stitch, every weave, every choice of material reflected the battle against winter's chill. Wool. The king of medieval fabrics. When it came to cold weather clothing, wool was everything. Sheep were everywhere in medieval Europe, and their wool was the backbone of both the economy and daily life. Why wool? Wool is naturally insulating, holding warmth even when damp. It can be spun into fine threads or left coarse for heavier garments. It resists water better than linen or cotton. It was relatively abundant, especially for peasant families who kept sheep. In winter, everyone wore wool: tunics, cloaks, stockings, hoods. It was scratchy by modern standards, but it worked. The warmth of a good wool cloak often meant the difference between enduring the cold and falling ill. Linen. The hidden layer. Though wool was the outer armor against the cold, linen was the fabric worn closest to the skin. Underclothes. Simple. Shirts, shifts, or chemises were usually linen. Linen absorbed sweat, kept the body cleaner, and prevented wool from irritating the skin. Even in winter, this base layer was vital. A peasant might own only one or two linen undergarments carefully washed and patched, but these provided comfort and a clean layer beneath rougher outer clothes. Layering. The medieval technique surviving. Winter meant layering garments much like we do today. A typical peasant man might wear linen shirt, woolen tunic, thigh-length, belted at the waist, woolen hose or leggings tied to the tunic with cords, cloak or mantle pinned at the shoulder, or throat hood. Cap or coif to cover the head. A woman might wear linen shift, woolen kirtle, long fitted dress, overdress or gown of heavier wool, cloak or mantle, woolen veil or hood. Each layer trapped warmth, and garments could be adjusted as needed for work indoors or outdoors. Cloaks and mantles. The most iconic medieval winter garment was the cloak. Made of heavy wool, often lined with fur for those who could afford it, The cloak was a versatile shield against the elements. Cloaks were fastened with brooches or simple pins and could be pulled tightly around the body. In bitter cold, people sometimes slept in their cloaks, adding another layer over their bedding. For travelers, the cloak doubled as a blanket on the road. Head and hands, the forgotten extremities. Medieval people understood something modern survivalists know well. Most body heat is lost through the head and extremities. To protect against this they wore hoods. Long, pointed hoods called liripipes were common. They covered the head, neck, and shoulders in one piece. Coifs, simple linen caps tied under the chin, were worn under hoods or hats. Woolen hats, knitted caps, felted hats, or wide-brimmed hats helped keep in warmth. For hands, gloves or mittens were used, though not always common among peasants. Mittens were easier to make and warmer than gloves. Leather, fur, or wool might be used depending on availability. Feet were especially vulnerable. Woolen hose covered the legs, but shoes were usually made of leather and offered little insulation. To compensate, peasants used foot wraps, strips of cloth wound around the feet, or stuffed shoes with straw or moss for warmth. Wooden clogs or pattens could be strapped over shoes to lift them out of mud and snow. Fur, a luxury and a lifesaver. Fur was the warmest material available, but it was expensive. Nobles lined cloaks and gowns with fur from ermine, sable, or squirrel. Sumptuary laws in some regions restricted certain furs to the wealthy. Peasants had fewer options, but they sometimes used rabbit, sheep, or fox pelts. Even a single fur-lined hood or collar provided immense warmth. Children in particular might be wrapped in fur scraps to keep them warm through long nights. Children's clothing. Children wore the same types of garments as adults, just smaller. In winter, parents bundled them in extra layers, often reusing and patching old clothes. Infants were swaddled in linen and wool, wrapped tightly to conserve heat. Mothers sometimes placed babies near the fire, or even beside animals for warmth. Childhood illness was common, and keeping little bodies warm was a constant worry. Clothing for work peasants couldn't stop working just because it was cold. Fields, animals, and homes still required care. Winter clothing had to allow for movement. Men wore tunics belted at the waist, often hiking them up for labor. Hose, though warm, tore easily and were constantly patched. Cloaks were left at home during work, as they could get in the way. Instead, workers relied on wool tunics and hoods. Women, responsible for cooking, weaving, and child care, wore layered gowns and aprons. Indoors, smoke from the hearth made garments smell strongly, and ashes sometimes scorched hems. Clothing was practical, not fashionable for most people. Repair and recycling clothing was too valuable to discard. Garments were patched, darned, and mended until they could no longer be worn. Old clothes were cut down into smaller garments for children or turned into rags and blankets. Wool could be refulled, washed, beaten, and shrunk back into dense fabric. This recycling kept clothing serviceable year after year. In winter, every patch, every extra layer mattered. Specialized garments in some regions. People used specialized winter gear, sheepskin coats, durable and warm, used especially by shepherds. Felted wool boots. In colder climates, thick felted footwear protected feet better than leather alone. Head-to-toe coverings. In Northern Europe, garments resembling modern snowsuits were cobbled together from multiple layers. Though crude, these innovations show how seriously medieval people took the threat of cold. Colors and symbolism. Winter clothing was practical, but it also carried meaning. The poor wore drab browns, grays, and natural wool colors. Dyes were expensive and bright colors were rare. The wealthy displayed status with richly dyed fabrics, deep reds, blues, and greens, and furs lining their cloaks. In towns and courts, clothing was both warmth and a social signal. On feast days, even peasants might wear their best tunic, kept safe most of the year. Washing and hygiene. Winter made washing clothing difficult. Cold water and frozen rivers limited laundry. People washed garments less often, relying on linen underclothes to absorb sweat and keep outer wool layers somewhat clean. Smoke from hearths permeated everything. While unpleasant to modern noses, this smoke actually deterred insects like lice and fleas, which carried disease. In a strange way, smoky clothes were a form of protection, clothing as identity. For medieval people, clothing was more than warmth. It showed age, gender, class, and occupation. A peasant in patched wool looked different from a merchant in dyed cloth, who looked different still from a noble in fur-lined velvet. But in winter, when survival was the priority, distinctions blurred. Everyone wrapped themselves in wool, pulled cloaks tightly around their shoulders, and endured. Contrast with modern America. For us today, clothing is abundant, cheap, and specialized. We can choose from down jackets, waterproof boots, heated gloves. We can buy new clothes easily when old ones wear out. In the 14th century, every garment was handmade. Every thread represented hours of spinning, weaving, and sewing. A wool cloak might take weeks to produce, from shearing the sheep to finishing the fabric. Clothing was wealth, and to own enough layers for winter was not guaranteed. Dropped into their world, a modern American would find their jeans and t-shirts useless. Without woolen hose, heavy cloaks, and sturdy boots, the cold would seep in quickly. Survival required not just clothing, but the knowledge of how to wear it, repair it, and stretch it across years of use. The daily ritual of dressing, each morning in winter, dressing was itself an act of survival. Pulling on cold, stiff garments, wrapping a cloak tight before stepping outside, checking shoes for damp straw stuffing, making sure children were bundled. It wasn't fashion, it wasn't comfort. It was preparation for another day of enduring the bitter season. Fire and fuel. The battle to stay warm. If you imagine yourself in the 14th century, think about how quickly the cold would creep into your bones. Modern Americans can simply turn up a thermostat, light a gas fireplace, or plug in an electric heater. For medieval people, heat came from just one place: fire. But fire required fuel, and fuel was often scarce, expensive, and hard to transport. Surviving the cold wasn't just about having a hearth. It was about securing, rationing, and managing fuel in a world where every spark of warmth had to be earned. The hearth, the heart of the home. The hearth was the center of medieval life. In a peasant cottage, it was often just a simple fire pit. On the floor, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or drifting out cracks in the walls. In wealthier homes, there might be a stone fireplace with a chimney, but even that was smoky and inefficient compared to modern heating. The hearth provided heat for the family, a place to cook meals, light in the dark winter evenings. Symbolic comfort. The hearth was literally life, but a fire only burned as long as fuel lasted. And gathering enough fuel for winter was one of the most difficult yearly struggles. Wood. The primary fuel wood was the lifeblood of medieval heating, but don't imagine endless forests, free for the taking. By the 14th century, much of Europe was already experiencing deforestation, especially near towns and villages. Peasants needed permission to gather wood from manorial lands. Lords often restricted how much could be taken or charged fees. Villagers had to share rights to common woodland, which often caused disputes. Travelers and the poor collected fallen branches, brush, and whatever scraps they could find. The best fuel was seasoned hardwood like oak or beech, which burned long and hot. But drying wood took months. Families had to plan ahead, stockpiling logs well before winter. Those who didn't or couldn't found themselves in danger when the coldest days arrived. Turf, peat, and dung. Not everyone had access to wood. In some regions, especially boggy or treeless areas, people relied on alternative fuels. Peat, turf, blocks of compressed plant matter cut from bogs, dried and burned. Peat was smoky but effective, and in parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Northern Europe it was essential. Animal dung, dried cow, horse, or sheep dung was used when wood was scarce. It burned with little flame but provided steady heat. Crop residue. Straw, reeds, and brush were sometimes added to fires, though they burned quickly. For poor families, dung and straw fires were often their only source of warmth. The smell was strong, but survival mattered more than comfort. Charcoal. The hotter fuel charcoal made by slow-burning wood in low oxygen was prized for its hotter, longer-lasting burn. It was essential for blacksmiths and bakers. However, it required large amounts of wood to produce, making it costly. Most peasants couldn't afford charcoal for daily heating. But in towns, wealthier households might buy charcoal to keep their homes warmer and reduce smoke. The cost of firewood wasn't just a practical issue, it was an economic one. In towns, firewood was a major household expense. Prices rose steeply in winter, and poor families sometimes had to choose between buying food and buying fuel. Historical records from London and Paris show winter shortages leading to riots. Without fire, even city dwellers risked freezing. Stoking the hearth once fuel was secured, it had to be carefully managed. Families couldn't afford to let fires burn freely all night. Instead, they banked the coals, covering embers with ashes before bed to keep them smoldering. In the morning, these could be fanned back into flame. Losing the household fire was a small disaster. Without matches, relighting meant borrowing embers from a neighbor, striking sparks with flint and steel, or in some cases, paying for fire from communal sources. Indoor warmth, or the lack of it even with a fire, medieval homes were bitterly cold by modern standards. Most cottages had a single hearth in the main room. Bedrooms, lofts, or storage areas were unheated. Stone walls and thatched roofs provided little insulation. At night, people slept in close quarters, often sharing beds for warmth. Heavy woolen blankets, cloaks, and even animals helped retain body heat. In winter, mornings began with frost, not just outside but inside the house, on the walls, the windows, and sometimes even the bedding. Fire was essential, but it was also dangerous. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, and straw floors made cottages highly flammable. A stray spark could destroy a home, and in crowded towns, entire neighborhoods. This danger meant many families limited fire size, even when cold was severe. Warmth had to be balanced with safety. Communal fires in villages, people sometimes shared resources. A communal oven, used for baking bread, doubled as a heat source for those waiting their turn. Public buildings, monasteries, and even churches provided warm spaces for gatherings. For the poorest, warmth might mean lingering near these communal fires or huddling in stables with animals. Fuel and urban life in medieval towns, fire management, looked different. Wood sellers brought cartloads from the countryside. Charcoal makers supplied markets. Regulations restricted when and how fuel could be stored, since large piles of wood were fire hazards. Urban families often lived in multi-story houses with small fireplaces. Fires were used sparingly, often confined to the kitchen. The wealthy could afford more, but even nobles rarely enjoyed the kind of steady warmth modern Americans take for granted. Monastic warmth monasteries had better resources. Monks kept fires in refectories, dining halls, and sometimes warming rooms. Still, most monastic cells were unheated, as enduring cold was seen as a form of discipline. Writing in freezing scriptoria with numb fingers was part of the religious life fuel as social divide. The ability to stay warm marked the divide between rich and poor. Nobles kept large hearths, multiple fireplaces, and supplies of wood or charcoal. Their great halls were still drafty, but warmer than peasant huts. Peasants struggled to secure enough fuel, often relying on inferior sources. The landless, poor, sometimes had no access to fire at all, surviving only through begging, charity, or huddling with others. Cold reinforced inequality. For the wealthy, winter was uncomfortable. For the poor, it could be deadly. Seasonal rhythm of gathering. Fuel gathering followed the seasons. Summer and autumn were crucial for preparing for winter. Wood was chopped and stacked to dry. Peat was cut and laid out to cure. Dung was collected and shaped into cakes. Failure to prepare meant hardship. Winter couldn't be negotiated with. Either the fuel was ready or the cold would take its toll. The psychological comfort of fire beyond heat. Fire offered comfort. The glow of the hearth was a source of reassurance on long, dark nights. Families gathered around it to eat, tell stories, or pray. For children, the flicker of flame was the closest thing to security. This psychological warmth mattered. In a world of cold stone, darkness, and uncertainty, fire wasn't just survival. It was a reminder of life's small joys. The modern contrast, today, Americans can heat homes at the push of a button. Natural gas, electricity, or oil systems maintain constant temperatures through the night. Firewood, if used, is a choice rather than a necessity. For 14th century families, firewood was a daily struggle. They knew every log by name. They calculated whether to burn it now or save it for January. They made constant decisions about warmth versus survival. Dropped into their world, most of us would quickly realize just how dependent we are on modern infrastructure. Without central heating, insulated houses, and easy access to fuel, we'd be at the mercy of the elements. Medieval people lived with that reality every winter. Rituals of fire keeping the fire alive became almost a ritual. Children were taught early how to bank coals, how to blow on embers, how to arrange wood for steady burning. Women managed the hearth daily, balancing cooking with warmth. Men often took charge of gathering fuel, but the daily tending was constant work. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was a companion, as alive and fragile as the people it kept warm. Summary: in the 14th century, fire was survival. But fire required fuel, and fuel required effort, planning, and sacrifice. Wood, peat, dung, and straw each played their role. Fires had to be carefully tended, rationed, and respected. For those who had enough, winter was bearable. For those who didn't, it was a season of shivering, sickness, and sometimes death. The next time you turn up your thermostat, imagine the families who gathered around a fading ember, praying it would last the night. Food and nutrition in a frozen world. The empty fields of winter. By the time December arrived, the landscape of 14th century Europe was bare. Harvest had long since passed, and the fields that once brimmed with grain now stood frozen. No crops grew, no fresh vegetables could be pulled from the soil, and livestock struggled to graze in icy pastures. For medieval families, this was the moment when preparation revealed its worth. Those who had stored wisely faced the cold with confidence. Those who hadn't looked toward winter with dread. The reliance on stored grain was the foundation of medieval survival. Wheat, rye, oats, and barley were not only the staples of bread, but also the base for pottage and ale. Granaries and storage pits were carefully filled during autumn, and the survival of entire families hinged on how much had been saved. Bread was often coarse and dark, especially for peasants, who ate rye or barley loaves instead of the finer wheat bread reserved for wealthier households. In times of shortage, bread was mixed with whatever could be found: ground beans, chestnuts, even powdered tree bark. Every slice of bread was a measure of survival. Root vegetables and the cellar tradition. When Americans today think of fresh produce, the idea of year-round availability comes to mind. But medieval Europeans knew winter meant scarcity. To bridge the gap, families relied heavily on root vegetables stored in cool, dark cellars. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, onions, and leeks were hardy enough to last. These were packed in sand, or straw to extend their life, often lasting until spring. Meals built around these earthy staples were repetitive but nourishing. A pot of boiling turnips or onions simmering on the hearth was not just dinner, it was life insurance against starvation. The role of meat and livestock meat was a luxury for most peasants, but the autumn slaughter was a critical event. In October or November, animals that could not be fed through winter were killed. This provided a burst of fresh meat, but it couldn't last long without preservation. Salting, smoking, and drying turned slaughtered pigs, sheep, and cattle into supplies that could be drawn on slowly. Pork, especially salted bacon and hams, was the most common preserved meat. In many homes, a strip of salted pork hanging from the rafters symbolized hope through the dark season. Livestock that survived, chickens, goats, a cow, provided eggs, and milk, though production dwindled as animals struggled against the cold. The preservation of fish was another cornerstone of winter diets, especially in areas where rivers, lakes, or the sea were near. Dried, smoked, or salted fish became staples, and in Christian Europe, religious fasting rules made fish even more important. Herring and cod, caught in great quantities, were traded across long distances and stocked in homes and monasteries. In inland regions, preserved fish connected people to distant seas, carrying with it the taste of survival. The constant pottage. At the heart of peasant survival was pottage, a thick, ever-changing stew of whatever ingredients were available. Grains, beans, vegetables, scraps of meat, and herbs simmered together in a pot that rarely left the hearth. Families would dip into it daily, adding new ingredients as they appeared. This dish was practical, filling, and endlessly adaptable. For the poor, pottage was eaten nearly every day of the year, but in winter it became the main defense against hunger. The scarcity of fresh dairy milk, cheese, and butter were staples in warmer months, but winter reduced their availability. Cows gave less milk in the cold, and feeding them through frozen months was challenging. As a result, preserved cheeses became a lifeline. Hard cheeses could last for months and provided protein and fat when fresh dairy was scarce. Butter, when it could be stored, was prized both for cooking and as a dense source of calories. Beer and ale as daily nutrition. In an era before modern sanitation, water sources were often contaminated, especially in towns. Beer and ale brewed from grain were safer to drink and carried calories with every mug. For peasants, small beer, a weak brew with low alcohol, was consumed daily, even by children. Stronger ales were shared at feasts and festivals. During winter, when food was scarcer, ale carried additional importance as a source of energy and warmth. Monasteries, in particular, became famous for brewing, offering both sustenance and comfort in the cold months. The role of honey and sweetness sugar was an expensive luxury in the 14th century, available only to the very wealthy. For most people, sweetness came from honey. Beekeeping was a respected craft, and honey was used not just as food but as medicine, and in the brewing of mead. During the dark months, a small taste of honey offered both nourishment and psychological comfort, a reminder of warmer, sunnier days, hunger and famine in harsh winters. Even with preparation, winters could bring hunger. If autumn harvests had been poor, or if disease struck livestock, reserves could run dangerously low. By February or March, the hungry months, grain stores were often depleted, bread grew thinner, meals smaller. In the worst years, famine stalked the land, claiming the weakest and poorest first. Historical records from the 14th century show entire communities facing hunger, when winter stretched longer than expected, or when crops failed the previous year. Food in noble and wealthy homes. The wealthy faced winter differently. Their storehouses brimmed with preserved meats, exotic spices, and imported goods. Nobles enjoyed pies stuffed with preserved venison, spiced wines, and candied fruits brought from abroad. Their kitchens were warmer, their hearths fuller, and their tables richer. Yet even in castles, fresh greens and fruits disappeared in winter, and meals leaned heavily on salted and dried stores. Wealth made survival easier, but even the rich could not escape the monotony of preserved foods. The emotional weight of food. Scarcity food was more than sustenance. It carried emotional weight. In winter, when daylight was short and the cold seemed endless, the presence of a loaf of bread or a pot of stew provided reassurance. Families rationed carefully, always aware of how many months remained until spring. Each bite carried not just calories but hope. For medieval people, food was survival distilled to its most basic form. The modern contrast, for Americans today, supermarkets overflow with options, regardless of season. Strawberries in December, fresh greens in January, exotic spices at every turn. Refrigeration, global trade, and food preservation have eliminated the seasonal hunger that defined the medieval experience. To imagine a 14th century winter is to imagine shelves growing bare, meals shrinking, and survival hinging on the wisdom of past preparation. The abundance we take for granted today would seem miraculous to those who huddled over pottage 7 centuries ago. Health, medicine, and illness in a medieval winter. The fragility of health in the cold months. Winter was not simply about hunger or cold, it was about the way those forces weakened the body. Malnutrition lowered resistance to disease. Smoke-filled, homes irritated lungs. Damp clothing and freezing air caused chills that could quickly become deadly. A single cold snap could tip a weakened person into illness. In a world without modern medicine, the margin between life and death was razor thin. The common ailments of winter. The illnesses that plagued medieval people in winter were many. Coughs and lung infections flourished in smoky, poorly ventilated houses. Fevers swept through villages, often without explanation. Frostbite and hypothermia struck those forced to work outdoors. The elderly and the very young were the most vulnerable, their bodies less able to fight the stresses of cold. What we now call pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza were frequent winter killers, though medieval people had no clear understanding of what caused them. The influence of malnutrition, a diet that leaned heavily on bread, pottage, and salted meat, filled bellies but lacked essential vitamins. By late winter, when fresh vegetables and dairy were scarce, deficiencies set in. Swollen gums, skin sores, and general weakness suggested scurvy-like conditions, though medieval records rarely name it outright. The hungry months of February and March saw the highest mortality rates, as bodies worn down by months of scarcity became easy prey for illness. The understanding of disease medicine in the 14th century was shaped by humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians. Health was believed to depend on the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Winter, with its cold and wet qualities, was thought to increase phlegm in the body. Treatments focused on balancing humors, often through purges, bloodletting, or controlled diets. Though inaccurate by modern standards, these theories gave medieval people a framework for understanding why winter brought sickness. The role of herbal remedies. Even without modern science, medieval people turned to the natural world for healing. Herbs were cultivated in gardens or gathered from woods and meadows, dried and stored for winter use. Garlic, onions, and leeks were believed to fight off chest infections. Sage and thyme were brewed into teas for sore throats. Honey was used to soothe coughs and heal wounds. These remedies offered comfort and sometimes real medicinal benefits, even if their effectiveness was limited by the knowledge of the time. Monasteries as centers of healing. Monasteries played a critical role in medieval medicine. Monks copied ancient medical texts, cultivated herb gardens, and treated the sick within their infirmaries. In winter, when illnesses multiplied, monasteries became refuges for the desperate. Their libraries preserved knowledge from classical sources, blending it with Christian charity and practical care. Though their treatments were constrained by humoral theory, the combination of shelter, warmth, and rest often aided recovery more than the remedies themselves. The plague in winter. The 14th century was scarred by the Black Death, which first swept Europe in the late 1340s. Though plague outbreaks could strike in any season, winter created conditions of vulnerability. Malnourished populations, packed into close quarters, made perfect breeding grounds for disease. Fleas on rats thrived in storerooms where grain was hoarded. Entire villages might find themselves decimated, with the cold amplifying the despair. For survivors, plague winters became a haunting memory of how fragile life could be. The struggle against cold injuries. Frostbite was not named as we know it today, but its effects were well known. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses turned black in severe cold, often leading to loss of limbs or life. Hypothermia was also a silent killer, though medieval people simply saw it as a wasting chill. Stories abound of travelers caught in snow, never reaching their destination. Even within homes, those who lacked fuel or blankets sometimes froze in their sleep, especially the poor and elderly. Childbirth and infant survival. Winter was particularly harsh for mothers and infants. Childbirth carried high risks in any season, but in cold months the dangers multiplied. Midwives worked in freezing rooms with little sanitation, Babies born in winter faced immediate exposure to chill, and without proper clothing or heating, many did not survive their first weeks. Families mourned these losses deeply, yet they were tragically common in the medieval world. The psychological weight of illness, beyond the physical suffering, winter illness, carried psychological weight. Families feared the sound of coughing in the night. Villages grew quieter as sickness spread. With little understanding of germs or contagion, people turned to prayer, charms, and rituals for protection. The church provided guidance, interpreting illness as both a natural trial and a spiritual test. Communities gathered for collective prayers, seeking relief not only from hunger but from unseen forces that seemed to stalk them through the winter. The difference between peasant and noble care, as with food, wealth shaped health outcomes. Nobles could afford warmer homes, more varied diets, and skilled physicians. They had access to imported spices, believed to warm the body and balance humors. Their infirmaries were better stocked, and they could summon healers in times of crisis. Peasants, by contrast, relied on local remedies, communal care, and endurance. Their bodies bore the brunt of cold, hunger, and untreated disease. Yet even among the wealthy, winter remained a season of risk. Status could ease suffering but not erase it. The long recovery of spring. For those who survived, spring was not an instant return to health. Bodies worn down by months of cold and scarcity often needed weeks or months to recover. Weakness lingered. Crops had to be planted, yet the workers were still weary. Recovery was as much about renewed sunlight and fresh greens as it was about healing from illness. Spring meant survival, but it also meant beginning the long cycle again, preparing for the next winter that would surely come. Community, faith, and the bonds that carried people through winter. The necessity of community in a frozen world. In the 14th century, survival in winter was rarely an individual achievement. Families depended on neighbors, villages leaned on each other, and faith bound entire regions together. Unlike the modern world where heating, electricity, and grocery stores make independence possible, medieval survival was collective. If one household faltered, others often stepped in, not always out of charity but out of mutual necessity. A community weakened by hunger or illness placed everyone at risk, so cooperation was as much a survival tactic as it was an act of kindness. Shared labor and resources. When firewood ran low or storms cut off travel, villagers pooled their labor. Men cut wood together in shared forests, dragging heavy logs back to homes or communal gathering spaces. Women shared the burden of food preparation, sometimes cooking in larger pots to stretch supplies across multiple families. Children, too, played their part, gathering kindling or feeding animals. In the depths of winter, the idea of mine and yours often blurred. If one family's cow still gave milk, neighbors might share in it. In return, those neighbors might offer bread, eggs, or help repairing a roof. Winter gatherings and hearth culture. The hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the heart of medieval social life. In villages where homes were small and dark, people gathered at whichever hearth had the most warmth. Stories, songs, and gossip passed through these gatherings, creating a sense of shared humanity in the face of harsh conditions. These evenings were not idle distractions but essential for morale. Laughter, storytelling, and the comfort of company lightened the burden of cold and hunger. For many, these winter nights at the hearth provided the memories that carried them through hardship. The role of the church in winter survival. The church played a central role in community life, especially in winter. Beyond its spiritual authority, the church was often a practical provider of aid. Monasteries stored food and distributed alms to the poor. Parish priests organized prayers for good weather and healthy livestock. Church calendars also structured winter through feast days, offering moments of joy and ritual amid the monotony of cold. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas. These were not only religious events but communal gatherings that provided psychological relief. Faith gave meaning to suffering, framing the trials of winter as part of God's plan. Feasts as moments of relief, while daily life was marked by scarcity, Certain feast days broke the cycle. Communities gathered to share food, drink, and music even if supplies were meager. A goose roasted at Christmas, ale brewed for Twelfth Night, or pancakes eaten before Lent. These were bright moments in a dark season. Nobles celebrated with lavish banquets while peasants made do with what they had. But the principle was the same. Feasting reminded people that life was more than survival. These rituals also reinforced community bonds, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves. Faith as a shield against fear in a world where medicine was limited and famine was real. Faith provided psychological armor. Illness was interpreted through a religious lens seen as either divine punishment or a test of endurance. People prayed for protection against the cold, for successful harvests, for health through the winter. Saints were invoked. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Roch for plague. Processions, candles, and charms brought reassurance, even when practical remedies failed. Faith did not stop illness or hunger, but it gave people the strength to endure them with hope. The winter church as a refuge church buildings themselves offered more than spiritual refuge. Thick stone walls provided shelter from wind and snow. In times of crisis, villagers sometimes gathered within churches, especially during storms. The flicker of candles, the smell of incense, and the chants of liturgy created an atmosphere of warmth and stability, a counterpoint to the chaos of winter outside. For peasants, the church was often the largest, warmest, and most enduring building they knew. The monastic model of winter life monasteries stood as beacons of stability during winter. Their routines of prayer, work, and study continued regardless of weather. Monks rose in the cold pre-dawn hours chanting prayers in unheated chapels. They tended herb gardens, managed granaries, and brewed ale that sustained not only themselves, but also nearby villagers. To many, monasteries represented order in a season of disorder. Even if their remedies could not always cure, their presence reassured communities that knowledge and faith endured the storms. Winter charity and the poorest were always at greatest risk in winter. Those without land, livestock, or reserves relied on charity to survive. Beggars gathered near churches or noble households, hoping for scraps of bread or alms. In Christian teaching, almsgiving was a duty, especially in winter, when the needs of the poor were most visible. While not everyone received enough to live comfortably, charity could mean the difference between life and death for many. In this way, faith-driven acts of generosity directly reinforced survival. The songs and stories of winter nights' entertainment was not a luxury. It was survival of the spirit. In long, dark nights, storytelling filled the gaps between work and rest. Tales of saints, fables of heroes, and local legends were told again and again, carrying moral lessons and cultural memory. Songs were sung to keep spirits high, sometimes lighthearted, sometimes devotional. These oral traditions were a kind of warmth in themselves, building resilience through shared imagination. In a world without books for most peasants, stories were not only entertainment but education and heritage. The social hierarchy in winter also highlighted differences between social classes. Nobles feasted in great halls, while peasants huddled in small cottages. Yet even the wealthy felt the pull of community in winter. Lords hosted feasts not only for their families but for retainers and servants. These gatherings reinforced bonds of loyalty and dependence, reminding everyone that survival was tied to the hierarchy of medieval society. For peasants, obligations such as providing labor or rents continued even in winter, though lords sometimes offered protection or aid in return. The balance between hardship and obligation structured village life, the psychological strength of togetherness. Perhaps the most important element of winter survival was not material at all, but psychological. Isolation was deadly in a medieval winter. Togetherness, whether at the hearth, in the church, or in the fields, reminded people they were not alone. A shared loaf of bread tasted richer when eaten in company. A hymn sung by a congregation sounded stronger than any voice alone. Community did not remove hardship, but it softened it. weaving a net of human connection that kept despair at bay. The lessons for the modern world, for an American audience today, accustomed to heated homes, stocked stores, and individual independence, the medieval reliance on community can feel foreign. Yet it carries lessons that resonate. In times of crisis, storms, blackouts, or even pandemics, people rediscover the importance of neighbors, shared resources, and collective resilience. Medieval winters, with their communal feasts, shared hearths, and deep faith, show how human connection has always been as essential as food or shelter in surviving hardship. Work, labor, and the rhythm of winter life, the nature of winter. Winter in the 14th century was not a season of idleness. Though fields lay dormant and snow blanketed the ground, life did not pause. For peasants and laborers, survival required constant work. Food needed to be stretched, fuel gathered, clothing repaired, tools sharpened, and animals cared for. Every task, no matter how small, contributed to enduring the season. Winter was a time of hidden labor, less visible than the sowing and harvesting of other seasons, but equally vital. Caring for livestock animals were central to survival, and winter care demanded relentless attention. Cows needed fodder cut and carried to them. Sheep required shelter from freezing winds, and pigs were often slaughtered in late autumn to provide salted meat through the winter. Chickens had to be kept alive for their eggs, though many stopped, laying in the darkest months. Barns and byres filled with the smell of hay and dung, where families sometimes slept alongside animals for warmth. Caring for livestock was exhausting, but losing even one cow or ox could mean ruin. The labor of fuel. Gathering fuel was life in winter. Families cut wood, collected brush, and gathered peat or dried dung in autumn, but supplies always dwindled faster than expected. Men and older boys often made dangerous journeys into forests during snowfalls to cut more wood, risking frostbite or accidents. Women and children scavenged for kindling, pulling fallen branches from hedges or dried stalks from harvested fields. In regions without abundant trees, peat bogs or animal dung became essential, though their heat was weaker than wood. Each fire lit was a triumph of labor. Food preservation and preparation winter kitchens were spaces of constant work. Salted pork or beef had to be soaked before cooking to remove excess salt. Grains needed grinding, sometimes on hand mills when larger mills froze. Women stirred pottages for hours, stretching thin ingredients into filling meals. Beer brewed. In autumn soured quickly, so ale had to be brewed again during winter months, often in smaller batches. Dairy was scarce, but when possible, butter or cheese made in summer was rationed carefully. Preservation wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive, labor-intensive, and essential. Textile work and clothing. Repair winter was the season of textile labor. With outdoor work limited, families turned to spinning, weaving, and sewing. Wool shorn in summer was carded, spun into yarn, and woven into cloth. Women repaired worn garments, patched holes, and knit or stitched new items. Clothing was layered, often in coarse fabrics, but warmth mattered more than fashion. Shoes, often made of leather, were patched and resoled repeatedly. Mittens, caps, and cloaks were crafted from scraps, ensuring every member of the household had at least some protection from the cold. Tool maintenance and repair. The long nights of winter were spent maintaining the tools needed for spring. Plows, hoes, and scythes were sharpened and repaired by hand. Blacksmiths continued their trade through the season, repairing metal fittings for harnesses, hinges, and carts. Wooden tools, handles, and barrels were mended. These tasks not only kept hands busy but ensured readiness for the planting season. Neglecting tool repair could mean disaster when spring came and work demanded them. Construction and shelter. Upkeep houses and barns suffered under the weight of snow and ice. Roofs had to be checked, leaks patched with straw or clay, and walls reinforced against drafts. Thatch was inspected for holes where rain or snow might seep in. Floors, often simple earth, were repacked and covered with reeds or rushes to reduce dampness. Barn doors were repaired to keep animals safe, and fences were reinforced against winter storms. Maintenance work was never ending, for the cold exposed every weakness in medieval buildings. The work of brewing and baking communities often shared resources for brewing and baking, since ovens and brewing equipment were expensive. In winter, alehouses brewed small, weak ales that kept villagers hydrated when water supplies were unsafe. Communal ovens baked bread for multiple families, with women bringing their dough to be cooked in turn. The rhythm of baking days and brewing days structured village life, ensuring steady supplies of basic nourishment. These tasks also reinforced community ties, as labor overlapped and neighbors worked together. Hunting, foraging, and supplementary food. Though food was scarce, some supplementary sources were sought in winter. Men hunted rabbits, deer, or wild birds when possible, though hunting laws often restricted peasants from taking game. Poaching was dangerous but common, especially in hungry months. Foraging continued too. Nuts stored from autumn, roots dug from frozen ground, and wild herbs gathered when visible. Fishing, where rivers were not frozen, provided protein. These activities were unpredictable but sometimes life-saving, especially when grain stores dwindled. Children's role in winter work. Children were not idle in winter. They gathered firewood, fetched water from frozen streams, scattered grain for poultry, or spun yarn under their mother's guidance. Older children might watch over animals or help carry heavy loads. Winter was also when children learned skills by watching and imitating adults, spinning, sewing, mending, cooking. Survival in the medieval world was a family effort, and even the youngest contributed in some way. The nobility's winter work. For nobles, winter labor looked very different. Their households buzzed with servants maintaining grand halls, kitchens, and stables. Hunting was a noble pastime in winter, providing sport and food. Nobles also oversaw estate accounts, planning rents, taxes, and obligations for the coming year. They managed the collection of tithes and ensured their dependents' loyalty. While peasants worked with their hands, nobles' labor was administrative and symbolic, ensuring the survival of their status and estates. Yet even lords felt the weight of winter, for shortages and illness did not spare them entirely. The psychological value of work was more than survival. It was distraction. Winter was long, dark, and frightening. Keeping busy helped villagers manage fear and despair. A repaired garment, a patched roof, or a loaf of bread pulled from an oven were tangible victories against the season. Work gave purpose, structure, and reassurance. In this way, labor was not only physical but emotional, a shield against the hopelessness that could creep into idle minds. The endless cycle of preparation. What made medieval winters survivable was the constant cycle of preparation. Work in winter was not only about the present, it was about the future. Every stitch, every log of wood, every repaired tool was an investment in spring. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that another winter was always coming. Their labor was cyclical, never-ending, and rooted in the knowledge that survival today was inseparable from preparation for tomorrow. Songs, stories, and festivals. The cultural life of winter, the place of culture in a season of survival. In the harshest months of the 14th century, when fields lay barren and days were short, medieval people turned inward. Survival was about more than full bellies and warm fires. It was about keeping the spirit alive. Culture provided light in the darkness. Songs at the hearth, stories whispered to children, plays staged in the churchyard, and festivals that broke the monotony of hunger and cold. For the medieval mind, winter was not only endured, it was filled with meaning, color, and ritual. The hearth as a stage of imagination. The hearth was the theater of medieval winter. As snow howled outside and fire crackled within, families gathered to pass long nights with stories. Parents told children tales of saints who performed miracles, kings who conquered kingdoms, and tricksters who outwitted stronger foes. These stories were not idle diversions. They carried lessons about morality, survival, and faith. In a world without books for most peasants, oral storytelling was the archive of culture, transmitting wisdom from one generation to the next. Winter. Songs and the sound of survival music warmed souls as much as fire warmed bodies. Villagers sang while working, tending animals, spinning yarn, or brewing ale. Winter songs often celebrated resilience, mocked hardship, or invoked divine protection. Some were local ballads, passed down orally. Others were church hymns sung during feasts and processions. In noble halls, minstrels entertained with harp, lute, or fiddle, while peasants contented themselves with simpler instruments, drums, pipes, or their own voices. Song lifted spirits, reminded people they were not alone, and synchronized the rhythms of labor and leisure. The power of folklore. In winter nights, folklore was richest in winter, when the imagination filled gaps left by the absence of daylight. Ghost stories were popular, warning listeners of spirits wandering the snow or demons lurking in the dark. Tales of fairies, witches, and shapeshifters were common in Northern Europe, giving supernatural explanations to eerie sounds of wind and creaking timber. These stories instilled both fear and wonder, teaching children caution while entertaining adults. Winter folklore turned the natural dangers of the season into narratives that gave them meaning. The festival of Christmas was the great centerpiece of the medieval winter calendar, beginning with Advent in late November and culminating in a 12-day celebration. It was both a religious and communal event. For peasants, it offered rare moments of feasting, when lords distributed food or allowed hunting rights as gifts. Churches held midnight masses, their cold stone walls brightened with candles and greenery. Families decorated homes with holly, ivy, or evergreen branches, symbols of endurance through the dark season. Even in hunger, Christmas brought joy, a reminder of hope amid hardship. Twelfth Night and the Inversion of Order. The climax of Christmas celebrations was Twelfth Night, when social order briefly turned upside down. Lords might play the fool. Servants became masters, and mock kings were chosen to preside over festivities. This playful inversion released tension in rigid medieval hierarchies, reminding communities of the bonds between classes. Feasting, dancing, and drinking accompanied the merriment, offering one final burst of cheer before the austerity of Lent approached. These rituals also reminded people that hardship could be endured with humor and laughter. Candlemas and the Hague. Return of light by early February. When winter's grip was still firm, Candlemas brought symbolic relief. This feast celebrated the presentation of Christ in the temple, but also marked the turning of the seasons. Candles were blessed and carried in procession, illuminating dark churches and reminding congregations that light would return. Villagers brought candles home, believing they protected against storms and sickness. Candlemas was not the end of winter, but it reassured medieval people that the cycle of nature continued and that spring would follow the frost. Storytelling. In noble halls, while peasants told stories at the hearth, nobles filled their long evenings with epic tales. Minstrels and bards recited romances of King Arthur, Charlemagne, and legendary knights. These stories blended entertainment with ideals of chivalry, loyalty, and honor. For nobles, storytelling reinforced their identity, reminding them of their place in a world of lineage and power. In dimly lit halls with tapestries blocking the drafts, listeners were transported to lands of dragons and quests, even as snow piled high outside. Plays and performances in winter was also the season for plays, often staged by church groups. Mystery plays depicted biblical stories, while morality plays offered lessons about virtue and sin. Performed in town squares or churchyards, they drew crowds eager for diversion. Costumes, props, and humor brought life to familiar stories, uniting communities in laughter and reflection. For peasants who owned no books and rarely traveled, these plays were a vivid form of education, reminding them of salvation and moral order amid the chaos of winter. Superstition and ritual. In the dark months, winter bred superstition, and rituals helped ease anxiety. People believed charms could ward off illness, prayers could protect livestock, and certain foods carried symbolic power. On New Year's Day, special cakes or breads were baked for luck. Ashes from the Yule log were kept to protect against lightning. Even small gestures, crossing oneself before entering a dark barn, hanging herbs over doorways, provided psychological security. These practices blended faith with folklore, showing how medieval people layered meaning onto the challenges of winter. Children's games and learning children, too, had their cultural life in winter. When chores allowed, they played games indoors, simple dice, riddles, or singing games. In some regions, children crafted small toys from wood, cloth, or bones, keeping imagination alive. Winter was also when children absorbed cultural knowledge, learning songs, prayers, and stories by heart. Their games often mimicked adult life, herding pebbles as sheep or pretending to cook in miniature kitchens. Even in hardship, childhood carried moments of joy, shaped by the rhythm of winter culture. Feast and famine in song and story. One recurring theme in winter culture was the contrast between feast and famine. Song celebrated abundance on festival days but also lamented hunger in lean times. Stories warned of greedy kings or careless farmers who failed to prepare. Humor often masked fear, as villagers sang satirical verses about empty pantries or weak ale. These cultural expressions acknowledged suffering while transforming it into something communal, reminding everyone that hardship was shared, not borne alone. The cultural resilience of winter. Ultimately, the songs, stories, and festivals of winter were not luxuries, they were survival strategies. They provided rhythm to long, monotonous months, gave hope when food ran low, and bound communities together in shared rituals. Medieval winters were dark and deadly, but they were also filled with color, sound, and meaning. Through culture, people turned hardship into memory and survival into heritage. The dangers and tragedies of winter. The ever-present threat of hunger was the greatest enemy of winter. Even well-prepared households found their stores dwindling by January or February. Bread grew coarse, stretched with chaff or beans. Ale soured and meat became scarce. Some families diluted flour with acorns or ground up peas, producing bitter bread that barely sustained them. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making bodies more vulnerable to disease. Hunger gnawed not only at the stomach but at the mind, breeding despair and hopelessness as people watched supplies vanish. The specter of famine. In bad years, when harvests had failed or warfare disrupted supplies, hunger tipped into famine. The 14th century was notorious for the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when torrential rains ruined crops across Europe. In such winters, people ate cats, dogs, and horses. Chronicles even whisper of cannibalism during the worst moments, though whether literal or exaggerated, the rumors reflect genuine desperation. Famine winters left lasting scars, families broken, children orphaned, and villages emptied. Survival often depended less on preparation and more on sheer luck. Disease in the cold months. Winter did not halt disease, it often worsened it. Crowded houses, damp with smoke and poorly ventilated, became breeding grounds for illness. Respiratory. Diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis thrived in cold air. Dysentery spread when water sources froze and sanitation broke down. Skin diseases like scabies or lice infestations were constant companions of the poor. For those weakened by hunger, even a fever could be fatal. Though the plague would not strike until the mid-14th century, winter already carried its own pandemics of suffering. The strain of isolation. Winter isolated medieval communities. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, and snow blocked mountain passes. Villages turned inward, cut off from markets, fairs, and travelers. For peasants, this meant little chance of acquiring food or goods from outside. For the sick, it meant no doctors or clergy could easily reach them. Isolation heightened fear, as people felt trapped in their villages, at the mercy of the season. For many, it was a psychological as much as a physical trial. The cold is a silent killer. Cold itself was lethal. Frostbite could cripple hands and feet, making daily work nearly impossible. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable, often dying quietly in their sleep when the hearth could not provide enough warmth. In homes with only one small fire, families huddled together under threadbare blankets, shivering through long nights. The poor, who lacked strong walls or good clothing, sometimes froze to death in their huts. Chronic exposure led to coughs, aching joints and weakened lungs that left lasting effects even for survivors. Fire and smoke hazards. Ironically, the very fires that sustained life could also take it. Chimneys were rare in peasant homes. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. A sudden flare of sparks could ignite thatch, turning an entire house into an inferno. Families sometimes suffocated from smoke trapped inside during stormy nights, when ventilation was blocked. Fire was both salvation and hazard, a reminder that every element of survival carried risks. Starvation among animals, livestock, essential to survival, often suffered terribly in winter. Hay stores ran out, water froze in troughs, and disease spread quickly in cramped barns. When animals died, families lost not only meat but also milk, wool, hides, and labor for plowing in spring. In famine winters, desperate people sometimes ate their plow animals, dooming themselves to hardship in the following season. Every lost animal meant diminished chances of recovery once the snow melted. The toll of accidents. Winter labor carried dangers. Men cutting wood sometimes fell beneath. Trees or suffered frostbite while working in deep snow. Children sent to fetch water could slip on ice and drown in freezing streams. Women tending fires risked burns or accidents in smoky, dark kitchens. Without doctors or effective medicines, even small injuries could fester into fatal infections. Winter magnified every hazard, turning ordinary tasks into life-threatening risks. The sorrow of child mortality. Children bore the brunt of winter's cruelty. Malnutrition stunted growth. Hunger weakened immune systems and cold snatched away fragile lives. Many infants did not survive their first winters, especially if mothers themselves were malnourished. Medieval parents, accustomed to loss, grieved, yet learned to guard their emotions, knowing not all children would reach adulthood. Still, lullabies sung at night and prayers whispered over cradles show that love persisted even amid relentless loss. The burden of psychological despair. The darkness of winter weighed heavily on the medieval mind. Days were short, nights long, and hunger constant. People spoke of winter melancholy, a heaviness of spirit caused by cold and lack of light. Fear of spirits, disease, and famine added to despair. While modern readers might see echoes of seasonal depression, medieval people understood it through religion. Despair was seen as a sin, a failure of faith. Priests urged villagers to find hope in God, but for many, despair was an unavoidable companion. Burial in frozen ground. Death in winter brought practical challenges. Ground often froze so hard that graves could not be dug. In some regions, bodies were stored in charnel houses or simple shelters until thaw allowed burial. Families faced the grief of living beside their dead, a stark reminder of mortality. Churches, overwhelmed by winter death, sometimes buried multiple bodies in shared graves. The sorrow of loss was compounded by the harsh logistics of the frozen earth. Community and the weight of loss. Though winters were filled with loss, grief was shared. Funerals, masses for the dead, and prayers provided structure to mourning. Neighbors gathered to support bereaved families, offering food or labor when possible. Communities knew survival depended on solidarity, and even amid tragedy they leaned on one another. The collective memory of loss shaped village identity, binding people together not just in life, but also in death. The stark divide between rich and poor, while the poor starved, nobles feasted in their halls. Yet winter dangers reached all classes. Nobles still lost children to disease, and their retainers died of famine when rents and taxes drained peasant reserves. Resentment simmered in villages, as peasants saw their lords warm, fed, and secure, while they suffered. Winter magnified inequality, making clear the brutal divide between survival and comfort. For peasants, bitterness often lingered long after the snow melted. The resilience. Amid tragedy, yet for all its cruelty, winter did not break medieval people. Faith gave them meaning, rituals offered solace, and community provided support. Each loss was folded into the rhythm of life, part of a cycle both feared and accepted. Medieval winters were not simply endured, they were confronted, mourned, and woven into the collective memory of survival. Tragedy was constant, but so too was resilience. The legacy of surviving winter. The shaping force of winter was not a backdrop in medieval life. It was a shaping force. The rhythm of hunger and cold defined when people worked, prayed, and feasted. Agricultural cycles were dictated by the need to prepare for winter. Cultural traditions from Christmas to Candlemas grew out of the necessity of sustaining morale during the dark season. Survival strategies became ingrained in daily life, passed down as habits, stories, and rituals. The 14th century's brutal winters were teachers shaping a civilization's endurance, faith as shelter against despair. The church was the anchor of survival. Sermons reminded villagers that hardship was God's test, and salvation was the ultimate reward. Winter fasts and feasts tied suffering to the story of Christ, framing hunger and endurance as participation in sacred struggle. Monasteries distributed alms, sometimes saving entire communities from starvation. Faith was not an abstract belief, it was survival psychology, transforming despair into purpose. Without religion, the long, dark winters might have broken more hearts than bodies. Architecture, born of cold winter, left its imprint on medieval buildings. Peasant cottages were low, with thick thatch for insulation. Stone castles were drafty, but tapestries, shutters, and multiple hearths reflected efforts to tame the cold. Churches, though unheated, provided communal warmth during gatherings, where bodies packed together shared heat. Even town planning reflected winter needs. Narrow streets shielded walkers from wind, and markets clustered tightly to limit exposure. The architecture of the 14th century was, in many ways, architecture of survival. Food customs that echoed through centuries. Winter scarcity created food customs that lasted far beyond the medieval period. The heavy use of salted pork, smoked fish, and black bread persisted as staples in many European diets. Seasonal fasting patterns, abstaining from meat in certain weeks, arose in part from necessity, later codified into religious discipline. Even the festive foods of Christmas, like spiced cakes or roasted meats, symbolized abundance in contrast to lean months. What people ate in winter became both memory and tradition, shaping culinary culture for generations. Social hierarchies. Reinforced by winter sharpened the contrasts of social class. Nobles endured winters with discomfort, but peasants faced death. Lords could demand rents in grain and livestock even when peasants starved, deepening resentment. Yet winter also reminded the powerful of their dependence on the poor. Fields had to be tilled, firewood gathered, and animals tended. This interdependence, fraught though it was, wove together the medieval social order. Winters highlighted injustice, but they also reinforced the ties that bound villages, manors, and kingdoms. Winter and the imagination of danger. The fears of winter. Wolves prowling villages, witches cursing crops, ghosts wandering snowy fields, fed the medieval imagination. Darkness and silence left room for superstition to grow. Winter dangers became stories, and stories became folklore. By the 14th century, tales of winter spirits and monsters were deeply embedded in culture, shaping how people explained the inexplicable. Even centuries later, echoes of these fears linger in European fairy tales of forests, witches, and icy dangers. Winter seeded imaginations as much as it threatened lives. The role of community in endurance medieval survival was never solitary. Families huddled together in cramped cottages sharing warmth. Neighbors exchanged labor and food, bartering eggs for firewood or milk for wool. Villages pooled resources during festivals, transforming scarcity into shared celebration. The collective nature of winter survival strengthened bonds, creating cultures of cooperation that endured long after the snow melted. Survival was not only physical but communal, a truth medieval people understood instinctively. The shadow of the Great Famine. The early 14th century was marked by disaster. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 etched terror into memory, teaching that one failed harvest could topple entire societies. Chronicles describe skeletal figures begging in villages, children abandoned, and whole households gone. The famine shaped policies and fears for decades, making people hoard food, distrust markets, and cling more tightly to local supplies. Every winter after the famine was haunted by its shadow, as if hunger had become a ghost that stalked Europe. Winters as trials of faith and fortune. In the medieval worldview, surviving winter was not luck, it was divine will. Families who endured credited God's mercy. Those who suffered were seen as punished or as lessons for others. Fortune, fate, and faith were intertwined. This belief system gave meaning to randomness: a child's death, a cow's illness, a sudden thaw that spared crops. In a world of uncertainty, the cycle of winter was interpreted as part of a cosmic order, giving people both fear and reassurance. The resilience of children who survived. For the children who survived multiple winters, resilience became ingrained. They grew up accustomed to hunger, to cold fingers at dawn, to stories told by dim firelight. These children became adults who accepted hardship as natural. Resilience was cultural inheritance, passed down not through books but through the lived experience of enduring winter after winter. That toughness, shaped by necessity, was the foundation of peasant society in the 14th century. How winter shaped identity. Winter survival became a point of cultural identity. Northern Europeans saw themselves as hardier than Southerners, proud of their ability to endure long months of cold. Communities developed sayings, songs, and proverbs about endurance, that a true villager could withstand hunger, or that God's strongest servants came from lands of snow. These ideas shaped national myths, reinforcing pride in resilience and endurance. Identity was born not just in wars and politics, but also in winters endured. The continuity of tradition. Even as medieval society changed, new technologies, shifting borders, religious upheavals, winter traditions remained remarkably constant. The fires lit at Yule, the feasts of Christmas, the candle processions of February, these rituals tied generations together. They were not mere survival mechanisms. They were heritage, offering continuity in a world of uncertainty. The 14th century's winter life echoes even today, in holiday customs, seasonal foods, and the cultural memory of enduring darkness with light. Lessons for the modern reader. For a modern audience, the hardships of 14th century winter reveal both contrast and kinship. Few today in the U.S. fear starving when snow falls, yet echoes of medieval survival remain. The instinct to gather food before storms, the joy of holidays in the darkest months, the comfort of storytelling by a fire, all have roots in the long winters of the past. The 14th century teaches us that survival was not just about endurance, but about finding meaning in hardship, a lesson as relevant now as then.